Much of colonial Nigeria, empires moved on human backs long before vehicles entered forests of West Africa. Colonial economies depended on something far more brutal: young African men. Across southern Nigeria, entire villages lived in fear of carrier recruitment. Systems that transported weapons, alcohol, machinery, trade goods, colonial wealth. And in places like Ajo, the sound of drums could mean your son would never return home again. Rain hammered violently through the forest canopy. Carrier lines dragged slowly through the mud. Barefooted boys staggered beneath giant colonial crates. Some carried mirrors they would never own. Some carried bottles of gin they would never drink. Some carried rifles meant to control people exactly like them. Ahead of the line rode a British officer on horseback. Beside him walked a tall African man gripping a long cane. His name is Ekpa. And in Ajo, the people feared him more than death himself. In fact, Ekpa is synonymous to death, because colonial rule did not survive through European power alone. It survived through the fear mongers like Ekpa. And the fear always needed local hands, strong hands like himself. One exhausted carrier suddenly stumbled as they moved. The crate slipped from him. Crack! His neck smashed against a tree root. The boy collapsed, motionless in the mud. The white officer barely turned his head, but Ekpa stepped forward and furiously whipped the corpse repeatedly. "Stand up," he said. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because under colonial labor system, even death was not enough to stop the march. The endless forest swallowed the carrier and the carrier lines. Slowly into the fog they marched, as if the trees themselves were feeding on young men. Far away in Ajo, a woman woke suddenly from sleep. Then she heard it. Boom, boom. The recruitment drum had sounded. Everything stopped. Women rushed outside. Fathers froze. They have come again. Young men disappeared into darkness. Children started crying, because in Ajo, when they come for you, you never say no. The drums meant only one thing: another carrier list has arrived. Once your name entered the list, your body no longer belonged to your family. It belonged to the colonial road. This has been the case across most villages in the early 1900s. And people of Ajo feared three things. They feared death, they feared famine, and last, they feared the sound of the drum. Because the drum always came before suffering, before disappearance, before mourning, before mothers wailed endlessly inside forest paths for sons who never returned. Carrier labor did not simply exhaust villages. It destroyed them. It reorganized them. It made an entire society to lose its own, one after the other. Marriages changed. Fatherhood changed. Childhood changed. Fear became the infrastructure. Years earlier, Ekpa himself once has been a frightened carrier boy. His younger brother had collapsed beside a flooded riverbank during labor transport. Ekpa begged the white man and his officer to have mercy on him. Instead of having mercy on Ekpa, they flogged him publicly for several days for slowing down the line that was moving the colonial's carrier load. And while he screamed beneath the whip, his younger brother died quietly in the mud. That day, something inside Ekpa broke forever. From then onward, he stopped believing resistance could help anybody. Resistance never saved anybody. He had to realign with the white man to be able to be like them. If not, resisting them will mean suicide. Only survival mattered at this point to Ekpa. So he continued with the system. Eventually, he rose to the rank of the man who held the cane. And now, to protect his own household, he delivered other families, their sons, into suffering. At night, he drank heavily, alone. Sometimes villagers heard him screaming in his sleep. But every morning, he returned to his hand. The cane always returned to his hand. Fear has reshaped him into the very thing he had once feared. Whenever colonial goods arrived, palm oil crates, machinery, weapons, alcohol, trade supplies, Ekpa came, hunting for the bodies to carry them. Young men hid inside forests. Some families buried sons temporarily inside empty yam pits just to make sure that nobody sees them. Some families sent boys to distant villages, but eventually Ekpa always found them. And those who returned from career labor really returned home, sometimes maimed, many a time injured. One returned blind, one coughed blood endlessly, one screamed whenever he heard drums, and many never returned at all. Fear followed Aju slowly, not through war, but through exhaustion. One day, the village chiefs gathered and decreed that the only permanent escape from joining the white man's career route is to join one of these four societies. Number 1, the native healer society. Number 2, the ritual priesthoods. Number 3, the blacksmith guild of the society. And number 4, the advisory council of the society. These 4 guilds were the only things that could save a man from the colonial carrier quagmire. Colonial officers feared offending the spiritual power and depended heavily on blacksmiths for tools and repairs. So, initiated men were usually spared suddenly. Aju became obsessed with initiation, but protection demanded terrible sacrifice. Families sold lands. The economy was brutal. They sold goods, fishing nets, yam bands, and coral beads. And when that was not enough, daughters were married off early for bride price money. For transformed daughters, for bride price money. Fear transformed daughters into survival currency. Soon, girls in Aju stopped dreaming about love. Marriage became payment for protection. The colonial system was no longer merely carrying bodies away. It was quietly reshaping family structure, economies, and human relationships from inside the village itself. Among the young men of Aju lived a boy called Bulo. Bulo was quiet, sharp-eyed, restless. He watched everything carefully. He watched fathers secretly cry at night. He watched mothers age from fear. He watched girls disappear into forced marriages. But one thing haunted him mostly: his best friend, Ekene. Ekene had once been the strongest wrestler in Aju. Then Ekpa recruited him to join the white man's career. 3 months later, Ekene returned, looking half dead. Thin, scarred, broken. At night, fever shook his body violently. Then one evening, Bulo sat beside him outside his hut. The forest wind moved silently through the trees. Ekene stared into darkness, then whispered, "The white man does not carry the load." Bulo remained silent. Ekene continued softly, "We carry it for him until our bodies break." Tears rose slowly down his cheeks. If one of us ever escapes this, don't come back alone. 3 days later, Ekene died, coughing blood into the earth. And from that moment, something in Bulo changed forever. One afternoon, the drums sounded again. The entire village gathered in fear at the square. Ekpa stood behind several heavy colonial crates. Then suddenly, he pointed towards a group of boys. "Children, some barely 12. Carry them," he said. The boys hesitated fearfully. One tiny child struggled to lift a wooden crate. His legs trembled violently beneath the weight. Then suddenly, he collapsed hard into the dust. The crate smashed onto his shoulder. The child screamed in pain. His father instinctively rushed towards him, but Ekpa blocked him immediately with one hand. And he said, "Leave him. He's a man. Let him carry it." The entire square fell silent. Then Ekpa said coldly, "If he cannot carry wood today, he cannot carry the white man's load tomorrow." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The father stared helplessly at his crying son. Then slowly, the man removed his own wrapper cloth, folded it carefully, placed it gently beneath the wooden crate to soften the burden on the child's back. The child was even bleeding from his shoulder. His hands trembled violently, but he said nothing. He simply turned away quietly. And he walked back into the crowd, with tears rolling down his eyes. Even Ekpa briefly looked away, and Bulo, he never forget that moment. Not in a hurry. For the rest of his life, this moment has always lived with him. One afternoon before another career selection, Bulo witnessed something else that haunted him deeply. A mother sat beside her teenage son, rubbing charcoal across her hands to put on his handsome face, desperately trying to make him appear sick, ugly, undesirable. The boy looked frightened, then asked softly, "Mama, will it work?" The woman's hand stopped moving, but she could not answer. Outside, the drums continued. Fear has reached the point where mothers prayed their sons would look weak enough to survive. One evening, Bulo returned home and sensed something terrible immediately. His mother's eyes were swollen from crying. His younger sister, Adeswa, avoided looking at him completely. Then his father finally spoke. "Your sister's marriage has been arranged." Bulo froze. Adeswa was only 15. "To who?" he asked. "An old palm wine merchant from Ashi." Bulo's chest tightened violently. Then his father whispered, "Her bride price we pay for your initiation." Silence swallowed the room. Bulo looked towards his sister. Tears rose silently down his face. And suddenly, he understood the full horror of what fear had done to Ajo. The white man was no longer merely carrying bodies away. Fear itself was forcing families to destroy themselves from inside. That night, Bulo heard movement outside. He followed the sound quietly and carefully. And there, beneath the moonlight, he saw his father sitting alone, The old man held Adesuwa's childhood waist heads. He held Adesuwa's childhood waist beads in trembling hands, and for the first time in his life, Bulo saw his father crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, broken. Then the old man whispered, "Forgive me." Tears rolled slowly down his face. "I do not know how to save both of my children." Bulo stood frozen, and in that moment, his anger stopped being rebellion. It became a purpose. The next morning, the elders gathered for initiation discussions. Palm wine flowed. Ritual objects were arranged carefully. Then suddenly, Bulo stood up. "I refuse to be initiated," he said. The compound froze. His father stared at him in horror. "Do you want Ekpa to carry you away?" he asked him. "Foolish boy, bulls cannot stop the white man." Another shouted, "Education cannot stop whips." Then Ekpa himself stepped slowly from the crowd. Cold smile, dead eyes. "Run wherever you want to run to." He leaned closely. "Every road in this country still belongs to the white man." But Bulo's eyes burned fiercely. Then he replied, "If fear is costing us our daughters, our farms, and our future, then fear itself is the real slavery." Silence fell heavily across the compound, because deep down, everyone knew he was right. They knew. 3 nights later, before sunrise, Bulo secretly tied Adesuwa's waist bead inside his wrapper. Then he left Aju alone, barefooted, hungry, determined. As he disappeared into the forest path, the drums echoed again behind him. The journey nearly destroyed him. Carrier roads disappeared endlessly into fog. Sometimes Bulo passed abandoned loads beside rotting bones. Sometimes he heard distant crying deep inside the forest at night. The roads themselves felt haunted. It was a very lonely path. As if they remembered every young man carried into suffering, and still he kept walking. When Bulo finally reached Asaba, something unexpectedly happened. He became ashamed of Aju, ashamed of village accents, old customs, traditional rappers, illiteracy. He stopped speaking his language publicly. He mocked villagers internally. He began believing education alone made people superior. He believed he has escaped from the trap that the village had to offer him. But one afternoon, everything changed. Bulo stood inside a crowded colonial tax office, watching villagers wait helplessly beneath the sun. Sweaty farmers clutched coins nervously in trembling hands. Old women bowed repeatedly before clerks. Then a well-dressed African interpreter stepped outside. Clean suits, polished shoes, perfect English. The villagers looked at him with admiration, but Bulo watched him carefully. As the interpreter quietly inflated tax amounts and pocketed extra money from frightened farmers who could not read official papers, one old farmer begged desperately, "But sir, that is not what the white officer said yesterday." The interpreter smiled calmly, then replied in English. The farmer could not understand. The crowd laughed nervously. The old farmer paid anyway, and suddenly Bulo realized something terrifying. The white man was not the only danger. Fear plus ignorance created servants faster than chains ever could. That night, an elderly teacher told Bulo quietly, "Knowledge without courage becomes another chain." That sentence changed him forever. From then onwards, he stopped chasing education for status. He started preparing to fight fear itself. Years later, Bulo returned to Aju. No charms, no rituals, no marks, no sacred staff, just books and official papers. Some villagers laughed openly. Then suddenly, the drum sounded again. And instantly, the entire village froze in terror. Old trauma returned like lightning. Women grabbed children. Young men prepared to run. Ekpa had returned, demanding more carriers. Then Buller stepped forward calmly. The colonial officers backed aggressively at him, but Buller answered in fluent English. "Silence," he said. The officers exchanged shocked glances. Buller began reading colonial labor regulations aloud. Illegal recruitment, illegal punishments, unpaid labor abuses. Then Ekpa exploded with rage. "Seize him!" Men grabbed Buller immediately. The villagers panicked. His mother screamed, but Buller shouted, "Touch me, and this report reach the district office by morning." He pulled out a stamped document. He pulled up stamped documents, missionary endorsements, signed petitions, official complaints, and colonial officers' face changed instantly. Because suddenly, Buller was no longer merely a village boy. He was administrative danger, evidence, witness, and for the first time in years, fear changed everything. Then something extraordinary happened. Colonial workers ordered young men to lift heavy crates. But this time, nobody moved. Silence spread slowly across the square. The officers backed angrily again. Still, nobody moved. Young men who once fled into forest now stood beside one another, openly. Fathers stepped forward beside sons. Women stopped crying. Even the children remained still. The drums echoed again across Ajo. But for the first time in living memory, nobody ran. The entire system froze because suddenly the drum has lost their powers. Then slowly, Buller turned towards a nearby group of children standing nervously beside the crowd. Children holding wooden slates and books. Among them was Adesuwa's little daughter, and around that child's waist were beads almost identical to his mother's own. Buller smiled softly. "Walk." The children began walking down to the same forest road where carrier boys once vanished into suffering. But this time around, no chains, no loads, no whips, only books. Old women began crying openly. Men followed their loads. Men lowered their heads in silence because for the first time, the road carried hope instead of fear. As the colonial convoy prepared to leave, Ekpa stood silently, watching the children disappear towards the schoolhouse. Then suddenly, he noticed one small boy among them, his own son. The child quietly dropped a carrier rope into the mud and picked up a book instead. Ekpa froze quickly and completely. Then, slowly, his cane slipped down from his hand and fell into the mud. No words came out, only silence. Because in that moment, he realized the system he surrendered his soul to protect was finally dying. That night, Buller sat quietly beneath the moonlight. Carrier ropes hung silently from a nearby tree branch, and suddenly he imagined Ekene coughing blood, frightening carrier boys disappeared into the forest. Adesuwa crying on her wedding night. His father holding waist beads beneath the moonlight. The little boy struggling beneath the wooden crate. Victory suddenly felt heavy. Too many people had suffered before hope finally arrived. Then softly, he heard distant drums again. Buller froze instinctively. Even after all these years, he said, fear still lived somewhere deep inside him. But this time, children's laughter followed the sound. Buller looked towards the school path. Then finally, he smiled. A tired smile, but a hopeful one. Years later, school spread slowly across Ajo. Carrier lists weakened. The fear began dying, and mothers no longer hid sons whenever drum echoed through the village. But the people never forgot, because freedom finally has come. One stubborn village boy first defeated fear itself. Colonial roads eventually faded into dust, but the silence they taught people survived much longer. And across Africa, entire generations spent years unnailing the fears that once kept empires moving. The white man carried their bodies, but fear carried away their future, and it took one boy with courage to bring it home again. Thank you for listening. Please like our channel and subscribe. See you on the next one.